Part 1. I can sleep in the barn, she begged, the words tumbling out before pride could stop them. Her fingers tightened around the edge of her shawl, knuckles pale, as the rancher stood in the doorway with the lamplight at his back. For a moment, neither of them moved. The long journey had carved shadows beneath her eyes, but there was a quiet resolve in them too, something that made his chest tighten in a way he didn't like. He turned the key in the lock. The sound was sharp, final, echoing across the wide, empty yard. The house went dark behind him as he pulled the door closed, a wall of wood and decision settling between them. No, he said, not unkindly, but firm enough to feel like stone. He didn't trust his voice to say more. She swallowed. The ranch stretched out around them, fences disappearing into the dusk, fields rolling toward the distant hills. The barn stood off to the side, weathered and old, its doors swaying slightly in the evening wind. The air smelled of hay and cold earth. She had imagined warmth when she arrived, a hearth, a table, the sound of a life already waiting for her. Instead, she stood on a porch with her small suitcase at her feet, wondering how hope could feel so heavy. I won't be any trouble, she said softly, as if lowering her voice might soften his answer. I can work, I can stay out of your way. Just until morning. Her accent lingered on certain words, proof of miles crossed and choices already made. She didn't mention the money she'd spent, the faith she'd placed in letters and promises. She didn't mention that there was nowhere else to go. He kept his back to the door, as though turning around might undo him. He'd sent for a bride because the ranch demanded it, because neighbors whispered that a man alone couldn't keep things together forever. He hadn't sent for hope. He hadn't sent for a woman with eyes like that, eyes that seemed to look past the land and into the parts of him he kept locked away. Too many mistakes had taught him caution. Too many losses had taught him to shut doors before they could slam on his heart. The wind picked up, tugging at her skirt. She shivered and quickly straightened, unwilling to look weak. The barn will be fine, she repeated, nodding toward it as if convincing herself as much as him. I've slept in worse places. That was what did it, the calm way she said it, the unspoken history wrapped inside the sentence. He clenched his jaw. Mercy wasn't always kindness, he reminded himself. Letting a stranger inside his home, his life, could ruin them both. He told himself he was protecting her as much as himself. I said no, he replied, quieter now. It's not safe. He didn't explain from what. For a heartbeat, disappointment flickered across her face, quick and bright like a struck match, then vanished. She lifted her chin. Then thank you for meeting me, she said, dignity gathering around her like armor. I won't trouble you again. She picked up her suitcase. It was lighter than it should have been for a woman who'd crossed so far to be here. As she stepped off the porch, the boards creaked beneath her feet, sounding too loud in the growing dark. He watched her walk toward the barn, the distance between them stretching with every step. Inside the house, silence pressed in on him. He leaned his forehead against the door, eyes closed, listening to the wind rattle the eaves. He told himself it was done. That this was the sensible choice. Still, when he finally moved away, her words followed him down the hallway, settling into the corners of the house like something that refused to be swept out. I can sleep in the barn. Part 2. Night came down hard on the ranch, the kind of darkness that felt heavy enough to press against the windows. The house, usually a refuge, seemed hollow now, too quiet, every sound magnified by the absence of another voice. The rancher sat at the small kitchen table, his untouched supper cooling in front of him. The ticking of the clock on the wall marked time with cruel precision, each second a reminder of the choice he'd made. He tried to read, then tried to sleep, but his thoughts refused to settle. The image of her walking toward the barn replayed again and again, the straight line of her back, the way she didn't look over her shoulder. That bothered him more than if she'd cried or pleaded. She had accepted his refusal with a grace that felt undeserved, and it followed him like a quiet accusation. Outside, the wind swept across the fields, carrying the scent of rain. The barn loomed in the dark, barely visible from the house, but he knew it by heart, the loose board near the back, the latch that didn't quite catch, the draft that slipped in through the gaps. He'd slept there himself once, years ago, after an argument he hadn't known how to finish. Even then, he'd had a blanket and the comfort of knowing the house was waiting. She had neither. He rose and went to the window. A faint glow shimmered near the barn doors, then steadied. A lantern. She'd found a way to make light in the dark, he thought, and the idea struck him harder than it should have. She wasn't helpless. She wasn't foolish. She was careful, deliberate, surviving. That made his decision feel smaller, meaner. He poured himself a cup of coffee he didn't need, the bitter smell filling the kitchen. His mind wandered back to her letters, the careful way she described herself, not as a dream, but as a partner willing to work. She hadn't promised beauty or obedience. She'd promised effort. He'd respected that, even admired it. Yet here he was, hiding behind locked doors and reasons that sounded thin in the silence. A sound drifted through the open window, soft, uneven. He stilled, listening. It came again, carried on the wind. A cough, short, restrained, as if she were trying not to make it heard. His chest tightened. He told himself it could be nothing. Dust from the hay, the cold air. Still, he couldn't shake the image of her thin shawl, the way she'd shivered before straightening her spine. He paced the length of the room, boots thudding against the floor. "You don't owe her anything," he muttered to the empty house. This was the agreement, but the words rang hollow. Agreements written on paper didn't account for flesh and bone, for the reality of a woman alone in a dark barn because he'd been afraid to open his door. He stopped in front of the coat rack. His hand hovered there, then dropped. He turned away, then turned back again, caught in the tug of war between caution and something older, deeper. He remembered his father's voice, rough with years and regret. "Locking yourself away doesn't keep pain out. It just keeps you in." The lantern light flickered again, dimmer now. He imagined it guttering out, leaving her in complete darkness. The thought snapped something inside him. He grabbed his coat and pulled it on, the familiar weight settling over his shoulders like a decision made at last. He took the lantern from the hook by the door and lit it, the flame flaring bright. The lock turned easily this time. The door opened onto the cold night, and he stepped outside, breath clouding in front of him. Each step toward the barn felt like crossing a line he'd drawn years ago and sworn never to step over again. The ground was uneven beneath his boots, and the wind tugged at his coat, but he didn't slow. As he reached the barn, he paused, listening. Inside, he could hear her, small movements, the rustle of hay. Alive, awake. He pushed the door open, the hinges groaning softly, and raised the lantern. The warm light spilled across the space, illuminating dust motes and worn beams. She sat on a hay bale, back straight despite the fatigue etched into her face. She looked up when she saw him, surprise flickering across her features, quickly masked by composure. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the silence thick with everything that had been left unsaid. In that instant, standing in the threshold of the barn, the rancher understood something he'd been avoiding all night. Locking his house hadn't kept him safe. It had only shown him how empty safety could feel. Part 3. The lantern's glow settled between them, turning the rough barn into something almost gentle. Dust hung in the air like suspended breath. She rose slowly from the hay bale, careful not to rush him, as if any sudden movement might send him retreating back into the night. Her hands were folded in front of her, calm on the surface, though he could see the tension in her shoulders now that the light revealed her fully. "You don't have to," she said again, the same words she'd offered before, but softer this time, edged with weariness. "I'll manage. I always do." There was no accusation in her voice, only a statement of fact, and that somehow cut deeper than anger ever could have. He set the lantern down on an empty crate, the metal clinking quietly. "I know," he replied. His voice sounded different to his own ears, less guarded, more honest. He ran a hand through his hair, searching for the right words and finding none that could explain the years of caution, the fear of inviting someone into a life already shaped by loss. "That's not why I'm here." She studied him, her eyes sharp despite the long day, as if measuring the truth in his face. Outside, the wind rattled the barn walls, but inside, the space felt still, expectant. "Then why?" she asked. He took a breath. "Because I was wrong," he said simply. The admission tasted strange, but once spoken, it loosened something in his chest. "I thought locking the house would keep things simple. Safe." He gave a short, humorless laugh. "Turns out it just made everything colder." For a moment, she said nothing. She glanced at the lantern, then at the open barn door behind him, the dark yard beyond. When she looked back at him, her expression had softened, though caution still lingered there. "You don't owe me anything," she said. "I chose this. I knew it might not be easy." "I know you did," he answered. "And that's why I can't pretend this is just a mistake to be corrected in the morning." He stepped closer, stopping a respectful distance away. "You came here to build something. So did I, even if I didn't want to admit it." She exhaled slowly, the breath shuddering just a little. "Building takes trust," she said. And trust doesn't start with locked doors. Her words weren't harsh, but they landed with weight. He nodded. You're right. He extended his hand, palm up, a simple gesture that felt larger than any promise he could make. I'm not asking you to forget tonight. I'm asking you to let me do better tomorrow. She looked at his hand for a long moment. He could see the calculation there, the careful consideration of a woman who'd learned not to accept offers lightly. Finally, she placed her hand in his. Her fingers were cold, and the contrast against his warm palm startled him. He closed his hand gently around hers, not pulling, just holding. Then start by letting me inside the house, she said quietly, a faint smile touching her lips. He smiled back, something warm and unfamiliar spreading through him. That part, he said, I can do. They walked back across the yard together, the lantern casting a shared pool of light around their feet. The house no longer looked like a fortress, just a building waiting to be lived in again. When he opened the door, warmth spilled out, along with the scent of wood and coffee. She hesitated on the threshold, taking it in, as if memorizing the moment. Inside, he hung his coat and gestured toward the kitchen. We'll talk in the morning, he said. About expectations, about work, about everything. He met her gaze. No promises tonight, just honesty. She nodded. That's enough to start with. As she set her suitcase down by the wall, the house seemed to breathe, the silence shifting into something more companionable. He realized then that what he'd offered her wasn't shelter alone, and what she'd given him wasn't just forgiveness. It was possibility, fragile, untested, but real. Later, as he stood by the window and watched the wind ease across the fields, he understood the truth he'd been circling all along. Some doors are meant to be locked to keep the past out. But the right door, opened at the right moment, doesn't weaken you. It brings you home.